What is up, everybody? Thank you so much for tuning in to the first video on my coronavirus series. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about some basic virology, so what a virus is and how it spreads, as well as some very basic cell biology and molecular biology. But before we get into that, in case you don't know me, my name is Dr. Scott Kelsey Askinosi. I received my undergraduate and my master's in biomedical science from Missouri State University, and I received my PhD in cellular molecular biology from the University of Missouri. I currently work as a professor at Western Governors University, where I teach applied natural science, integrated natural science, as well as integrated physical science. And there I work primarily with individuals from underrepresented and underserved backgrounds, as well as students from rural backgrounds who would otherwise not have access to education. I also work as Director of Science and Technology at my wife's family's chocolate factory, and I have my own consulting business here in Austin, Texas, where I work with companies that are trying to develop and then implement new technologies in the healthcare field. So I wanted to make these videos because there's a lot of misinformation floating around right now about the coronavirus, and that has caused a lot of arguments that are unnecessary amongst people, especially on social media, that are really taking away from the main message that scientists are trying to convey in ways to actually fight the virus. So I got into science in the first place because I wanted to help people through science and technology. So this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. I love to educate people, and I felt like this was a great opportunity to spread some actual fact-based positive information on the virus so that we can all come together on a unified front to combat this virus together. There is this old saying that is, know thy enemy. And it's an old saying for a reason. If you don't know what you're up against, how on earth can you possibly fight it? So that's the purpose of these videos, to spread some actual true scientifically based information so that you can know exactly how to keep yourself and your family safe. Because right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, and there are a lot of things that are very unsure and kind of scary. And the unfortunate thing about fear is that fear allows people to take advantage. There are a lot of people out there that are using this fear to push their own agenda and spread false information. So this is a really great way, education, to be able to combat that misinformation, and again, know how to keep your friends, your families, and those close to you safe and sound. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the virus. Before we can actually get that far into the virus, we need to talk about some basic cellular and molecular biology. So let's go over here to our screen where I can draw. And by the way, those that know you know that I'm not a good drawer, but I think we can do well enough here to at least get the point across. So this right here is what we call a eukaryotic cell. And the reason we call it a eukaryotic cell is because it has this compartment here called a nucleus that keeps the DNA of the cell safe. So right here, these are chromosomes, aka DNA, and this is the blueprint for whatever organism this cell is from. So eukaryotic cells make up a majority of the organisms that we are familiar with. Eukaryotic cells make up plants, animals, fungi, and this other group called protists. And a lot of that's not really important information. The important takeaway here is that as a human, you are made of eukaryotic cells. And in every single one of your cells, you have a nucleus. And in that nucleus is the genetic information that acts as the blueprint that dictates everything about you physically. It dictates how many hairs you have, how wide your bones are, what color your eyes are, how tall you are. Every single thing about you physically is encoded in this blueprint. Now, let's talk a little bit about the molecular biology of a cell, because this is important to actually understand how a virus operates. So there is this idea that we call the central dogma of molecular biology. So the central dogma, and we'll say of molecular biology. And the central dogma goes like this. Our DNA, which is the blueprint for our cells, is transcribed into RNA, which is an intermediate, which then gets turned into protein. So let's talk a little bit about protein, because this is the word that you're probably most familiar with here. So when we think of protein, we generally think of like steak, right? Or chicken. We generally think of muscle fibers. But protein actually makes up a majority of your body. So it does make up your muscle fibers. So the muscle fibers that allow you to move your body around. It also makes up all of your connective tissue. So your cartilage and then bone, which is essentially just calcified cartilage. It also makes up pigments, so the things that give your hair and your skin and your eyes color. And equally as important, it also makes up what we call enzymes, which are the proteins that allow your body to do basic biochemical functions. For instance, your liver, it is supposed to essentially clean out your blood. If you have a rough night of drinking, your liver cells produce this protein, this enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase. And that enzyme's job is to break down the alcohol to metabolize it so that you can excrete it through your urinary system. Another example would be, let's say that you have a really big meal. Well, your pancreas then produces insulin, which is supposed to help control your blood glucose levels so that you don't have too much glucose in your bloodstream or not enough glucose in your bloodstream so your body can maintain that balance. There are a number of other examples of enzymes. There are literally hundreds of thousands floating around in your body right now. But those are just a couple that I feel like you'd be most familiar with. So as you can guess, protein is very, very, very important. In fact, the cells in your body are just like little factories whose job it is to make the proteins that you need to keep you alive. So this is why we call it the central dogma, because this is the heart of why organisms are able to exist in the first place. Is that this DNA, which is like the blueprint, is then turned into RNA, which then goes and is turned into protein. So your DNA is kept here in the nucleus. Think about your DNA, again, as like a blueprint. If you think about a construction site where they're building a new building, that building is going to have a blueprint. But you're not going to see the guys that are out working on the building carrying the blueprint around, right? It's too important. It's way too precious. That is the same thing for your DNA. So your DNA isn't going to leave the nucleus. It stays nice and protected in that compartment. And again, that's like the blueprint staying in the architect's office or maybe, in the main contractor's office. What that contractor is going to do is he's going to make a note and he's going to give it to his guys who are actually going to take it out into the building site and build the protein. And that's a lot like what the cell does. The cell takes the DNA, turns it into RNA, this transcript. Here, I'll write this right here. It's a little bit easier to see. And then that RNA is able to go out into the cell so it can be turned into protein. And again, this is why cells exist, to make this protein. So now that we understand a little bit about molecular biology and the biology of a cell, let's talk about a virus. So a virus is actually not a living organism. A virus is simply a piece of renegade genetic information that is encapsulated by this protein coat that we call a capsid. So it's just this piece of renegade genetic material that's enclosed in this little container. And viruses can come in a number of different forms. Some of them, like coronavirus, look like, little cockleburrs or something with all these little sticklies coming out. And then the genetic information is here in the center. Some of them also look like little aliens that have this capsid like this, and then all these little tendrils that stick out that allow it to grab onto the cell. So the way that a virus works is it's going to attach to a cell and find a docking site. So think of a cell in a way as kind of like the Death Star. There are all kinds of different ways into the cell, but in order to get in, you have to have the right identification. You have to have the right ID or else the cell's not going to let you in. And viruses have found very clever ways to get into the cells in that they present this identification to the cell. So when they stick onto the cell sees that identification and is like, all right, come on in, he's a friend. And the cell then makes these little, generally bubbles that we call vesicles, to bring whatever presents itself into the cell. So the virus actually tricks the cell into taking it inside so that it can start to do its job. And I want to mention really quick before we go any further, these are not drawn to scale. Viruses are incredibly tiny, again, because they're just a tiny, tiny little piece of genetic information that's surrounded by a tiny, tiny bit of protein. So if we're going to draw it to scale, this guy right here would be a virus. So these little dots here are going to be virus. that are going to present themselves with the ID and be taken into the cell. Once the virus is taken into the cell, what it does is it releases that piece of genetic information, which interrupts this normal process of the cell. So it's going to, instead of inserting the RNA to be made into protein, it's going to insert its own genetic information here to be made into protein. So what happens is the virus hijacks the machinery that the cell is using to make protein. So instead of making protein, the cell then starts to make virus particles. Once the cell starts making this virus particles, it's going to use, just like how it took the virus into the cell, it's going to use vesicles to actually transport the virus out of the cell. So in a cell's lifespan, from when it gets infected with a virus, it can produce millions of virus particles. So that means if one virus infects this cell and overcomes the machinery here and exploits the machinery to make more virus, that cell can produce millions of virus particles before the cell dies. Because if you think about it, the cell is producing protein to help our bodies. The cell is also producing protein to keep it alive because it needs these proteins, these enzymes, these structural elements to keep it alive. So if it stops making these proteins, eventually it's going to die because it's not going to have what it needs because it's going to be spending all of its time making these virus particles. So that's the basics of how a virus works, how it gets into the cell, and then how it gets back out. And now you also know some very basic cell biology and some very basic molecular virology. And this is really important to know for the upcoming videos because we're going to be talking a lot about how this virus is different from other viruses that we've experienced in the past, as well as what are ways that we can keep ourselves safe. And in order to, again, understand that, you really need to know what you're up against. Okay, so that's all for this first video. If you all have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on social media, on my YouTube page, however you want to get in touch with me. I'm making these videos for all of you out there so that I can answer them to the best of my ability so that you can have all the information you need, again, to keep yourself, your friends, and your family safe. All right, well, thank you for watching. Until next time, please stay safe and healthy.